to parse it all. CBS News Chief White House correspondent Major Garrett now joins me from Washington. Lots to get to here, Major, so let's begin where they did with Donald Trump's tax returns. As we heard Charlie Rose allude to at one point in that interview, essentially this is a question perhaps of a lack of transparency of someone running for president, one of the two likely, to be this country's next president. What to make of Corey Lewandowski's responses?
So Corey Lewandowski spent a lot of time talking about Donald Trump's personal disclosure form, which is his assessment of his income and his wealth. It is not something verified by the IRS, and it's not something verified by outside financial analysts. It's Trump's expression of his worth based on his estimation of his worth and his estimation of his income. It's not verifiable through a second independent source, like an IRS tax form. But Lewandowski said once the routine, quote unquote, that's his words, I don't know anyone personally who's ever been audited by the IRS who considered that procedure routine, but nevertheless, the Trump campaign does consider it routine to be audited on a regular basis by the IRS. When that's completed, Trump says he will release his tax returns. No date for that, and this does put a space between the American public and what verifiably can be said about Trump's assets, his income tax rate, what kind of contributions he makes in terms of charity. Lots of things you can learn from a tax return. Now, interestingly, it also came up in that conversation, past tax returns, those audits are all completed, could be released. Corey says you can't learn anything from that. Really? Well, perhaps you can. What we know for sure is we're not going to be allowed the privilege of learning what we might from the 2002 to 2008 Trump tax returns, because Trump doesn't feel under any obligation to release them. So we're in this circular argument, Josh, where there is this non-binding and non-legal justification, well, we can't release the tax returns because they're under audit. That's not a matter of law. That's not a matter of precedent. It's a matter of preference. Trump's preference is to not release them until the audits are complete. And that's a political calculation he's making that can, he believes, last against the request of the media and perhaps general voters to learn more about Trump finances. If this does political damage to Trump, he may reverse himself. So far it hasn't, which means he'll probably stay where he is.
Meanwhile, Lewandowski also spoke about the increasingly personal nature of attacks we're seeing going both ways at this point. He said again, Donald Trump is a counterpuncher, and when he does, perhaps he hits 10 times as hard. But we have now seen him ramp up attacks on the sexual past of Bill Clinton, suggesting and reimagining allegations of sexual abuse on the part of the former president. Yesterday, he also floated what he called the fishy nature of the suicide of Vince Foster, a former Clinton confidant. And this is all now essentially, again, against the backdrop of something that Roger Stone, a Trump ally, is also saying is actually a concerted effort of theirs to reintroduce the Clintons to a generation of voters who perhaps didn't live it the first time. If nothing else, it does seem that Donald Trump is looking to empty the bag here.
Empty the bag and do so early. Think about it this way, Josh. If you're 35 years old in this country, which means you've been allowed to vote legally for 17 years, you were 12 years old when Vince Foster died. 12. You don't know anything about this story. You don't know anything about the sagas of the Clinton years. You don't know that there was a Republican majority in Congress that spent a lot of time investigating this. Dan Burton, a Republican congressman from Indiana, was in charge of the committee that looked into Vince Foster's death. It was practically the political undoing of Dan Burton's entire career, chasing the Vince Foster quote-unquote suicide or possible other untoward outcome in that death. Maybe it was not suicide. Maybe it was something else. Dan Burton, Republican from Indiana, chased that rabbit down the rabbit hole. And as I said, it was nearly the end of his political career because he could substantiate nothing in relationship to Vince Foster's death other than what federal investigators had long since concluded, which it was a suicide with some rough edges around it, yes, indeed, but no one could ever come up with a plausible explanation about what did happen other than a suicide. Vince Foster was a close confidant of both Bill and Hillary Clinton. He came to Washington, found Washington to be a very uncomfortable place for him, where he said ruining people was the sport of Washington, D.C., and he cast himself as a victim of that sport of personal attack and ruination. And nothing's ever been substantiated other than that particular aspect of the Vince Foster Clinton story. And yet Donald Trump wants to revisit it. Not only does it make no demographic sense for voters who don't know anything about this or aren't familiar with it, it also gets away from what Trump has succeeded in doing in this campaign, which is identifying future issues. Slack wage growth, inability to create jobs sufficient to Americans' expectations, and a sense that its national security and foreign policy posture are not nearly muscular enough. All of those things Trump talks about with some degree of measurable political success. What he hopes to gain out of all of these past Clinton sagas continues to mystify me.
Major Garrett in Washington, we do appreciate the time today.
Thanks.